Um, Voy a hablar en inglés. I was asked to speak in English because we have translators and international audience, so if you don't mind to wear your headsets, I'll start the presentation. I would like to provide a brief introduction as to why do we need epidemiology and how epidemiology contributes in complying with international agreements. And the talk of my presentation is called Epidemiology and Veterinary Public Policy. This is a title that to me means a lot, because often when I'm asked to say or explain to people what I do, it's very difficult to say, well, I'm a veterinarian, yes, but I don't work with animals directly, and also I travel all over the world, and it's very hard for people to understand how come is a veterinarian not working with animals and sitting on a plane all of his life. So I came up with this title. What do? I do epidemiology and veterinary public policy. And people still don't understand, but at least you can say it fairly quickly and you move on to the next topic of conversation. So, why do we need international regulation? Historically, diseases have spread throughout the globe through the trade of animals and animal products. I'd like to give you a few examples just to set the tone. In 1920, there was an outbreak of rinderpest with animals that were moving from India all the way to Brazil and stopped in the port of Antwerp in Belgium and reintroduced rinderpest into Europe, where it had already been controlled and eradicated. Not only that, but those animals were reloaded on a boat and made it all the way down to Brazil. The first and only occurrence of rinderpest in this country. In 1942, or 46, I'm sorry, foot and mouth disease spread into Mexico through the trade of live animals, clinically healthy animals that were quarantined in an island in the Gulf of Mexico for well over a month, and introduced foot and mouth disease into Mexico. Over 1 million animals had to be destroyed to control this disease. And I'll talk a little bit more about that outbreak in a second. In the late 70s, we had an outbreak of African swine fever that was introduced from the Iberian Peninsula into the island of Hispaniola, which is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In order to control this outbreak of African swine fever, for which there is no vaccine, the only option was to destroy the entire swine population of the island. In one of the poorest countries of the world, where the devastation was so complete that even 2 decades later, the economic effects of that control program were still being felt. In the 1980s, we had an outbreak of the New World screwworm that moved from the Americas into Libya, and millions of dollars have to be spent to control the first and only occurrence of New World screwworm outside of the American continent. We all remember in 2001 there was a massive outbreak of foot and mouth disease that most likely was attributed to feeding pigs with meat scraps coming illegally from China into the UK. And over 6 million animals had to be destroyed to control this outbreak. That same year, we had a very big outbreak of foot and mouth disease occurring in Argentina and spread into Uruguay. Also, huge outbreaks. In that year, 2001, we had over 2,000 outbreaks of FMD in the UK, 2,000 outbreaks, ongoing outbreaks of FMD in Argentina, and another 2,000 in Uruguay. I think that was the highest record ever of active outbreaks ongoing, pretty much without a lot of control in the world. And of course we have BSE that spread from the UK to the rest of Europe and then to several other countries around the world. So clearly we need to do something about the spread of diseases internationally. That outbreak of Rinderpest in 1920 led to the creation of the World Organization for Animal Health, the OIE. And in 1924, it was created with only 28 member countries. Today, the OIE counts with 178 member countries. But it's not all the countries in the world, but they cover, these countries, almost 100% of international trade in the world of animals and animal products. The GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, led to the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. And with it came the agreement on the applications of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. The SPS agreement is an agreement that aims to facilitate trade. And all the countries that signed accession to the WTO have to comply with the agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. The SPS agreement, as I mentioned a second ago, is a part of the agreements that create the World Trade Organization, and therefore its objective is to facilitate trade, but recognizing that all countries have the right to protect human health, animal health, as well as plant health. There are many diseases that we are concerned about when we are trying to regulate international trade. This, of course, is foot and mouth disease, which is perhaps the most infectious disease that exists in both human and animal health. And we saw the destruction that this disease leads to. These are images from the UK in 2001. 6 million animals had to be destroyed to control a disease. And this is upsetting, because this is a disease for which we have a vaccine. The disease itself does not kill the animals, except the young animals. And yet, we are faced with this kind of destruction just to control a livestock disease. I don't think this is correct. I think we can do better. I think that as veterinarians, as a profession, we didn't go to school to kill animals like this. We went to veterinary school to deal with diseases because we are all about protecting public health. And how do we protect public health? We do it in different ways. One way is to prevent zoonotic diseases, which of course FMD is not a zoonotic disease, but that's the first aim. The second is to control diseases that have an impact on production. And the third way we contribute to public health is by ensuring food security. And food security means sufficient and safe food supply. So I don't think societies in general will allow to have something like this happen again. I hope not. I studied in Mexico. And Mexico had this outbreak I was telling you about, of foot and mouth disease, back in 1946. And it was eventually controlled and eradicated in 1954. During the course of that eradication program, several veterinarians lost their lives. And if you go to the faculty of UNAM in Mexico City, you will see this plaque in memory of the veterinarians that lost their lives during that program. Some of these veterinarians were killed, shot by farmers that didn't want their cattle stamped out. And one of those events happened in a small town in the state of Michoacán in central Mexico, where a woman initiated a revolt in the town and killed the veterinarian and 7 other soldiers that were coming with the veterinarian to control the disease in that small town. Every story has 2 sides. And I found this news clip in a local newspaper in Mexico, where in that town they are commemorating the events of that tragedy in that town, but they're saying that the woman was called Maria Teodora Medina was a hero because she said, "Before you kill my animals, I will kill you." And not only that, there is a monument to that woman in that town, and it says homage to the courage and patriotism of the Mexican woman. So every story has 2 sides. And we all need to remember that we're doing this also for the people. We're not really doing disease control for the animals per se, which sure plays a role. We have that responsibility. But we're doing it for a social reason, socioeconomic reason. And we cannot just go and stamp out diseases by killing animals without proper consideration to the social and political consequences that might arise from disease control efforts. So I thought that was interesting. There's also many other diseases that we should be concerned about. This is contagious bovine pleuropneumonia. This one is sheep and goat pox. This is a horse that drowned itself in its own secretions affected by African horse sickness. And it's not only virus and bacteria that we should be concerned about, but also external parasites like Amblyoma variegatum, which transmits heart water, or the New World screwworm, which is now eradicated from the United States all the way down to Panama, where they still have some remaining cases every year in the Darien area bordering Colombia. And of course, we have BSE. BSE is a disease that really has shifted the way we think and approach animal health internationally. Before BSE, countries could claim they were free from a disease because they've never seen it. Since BSE, every country has to demonstrate that the disease is not present, and millions of dollars are spent every year conducting surveillance for a disease that is largely under control nowadays. So really, mad cow disease has been an incredible crisis for the profession, for the way we approach animal health control programs, and our relationship with public health as well. So clearly we need to do something about it. And the SPS agreement lays out some basic principles on how to deal with disease control, how to deal with sanitary measures as they are applied to international trade. And the SPS agreement lays out some basic principles. And first of all, that the measures we apply need to have a scientific basis. Also, they need to be the least restrictive possible as long as they comply with your acceptable level of protection. You cannot discriminate, you cannot ask for a country to comply with a certain level of restrictions and to another country in the similar animal health situation ask for more stringent regulations, simply because you don't trust them very much, maybe. And therefore that means that you need to be consistent in the way you apply these sanitary measures. In general, the aim of the SPS agreement is to avoid the use of sanitary measures as barriers to trade. And every country in the world is guilty at one time or another of applying or using sanitary excuses to try to prevent trade, to protect their own animal industries. The World Trade Organization is not a scientific organization. Therefore, it needs to rely on 3 international organizations to develop international standards. The Codex Alimentarius for food safety, the IPPC, which stands for the International Plant Protection Convention for plant health, and the OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, that is responsible for developing all the standards for animal health as they relate to trade. The SPS agreement lays out 5 key provisions. And what I'd like to do for the rest of the presentation is briefly describe what each provision is about and how epidemiology helps us comply with the application of the SPS agreement in this context. The first provision is regionalization. Before the GATT, when we had an outbreak, a single outbreak of disease in a country, the entire country was considered infected. And that led to incredible restrictions to trade, which often were not necessary and not justified. With regionalization, we can now recognize that there might be zones within a country that are free from disease, whereas the disease is still being controlled in other parts of the country. Another concept that has been developed more recently is the concept of compartmentalization, which aims essentially at achieving the same thing, recognizing populations that are free from disease from populations that are not. But compartmentalization, as different from regionalization, aims at doing this but based on biosecurity and management versus on geographical grounds. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So you might have a country that might have zones that are free and not free. Think about the poultry industry. Think about the swine industry, which is vertically integrated. So you might have compartments that are free, and starting from maybe the genetic producers all the way down to the slaughterhouse, and compartments that are not free. What we are aiming to do, essentially, is to draw a biosecurity border. In regionalization, that biosecurity border is usually based on geographical boundaries, and in compartmentalization, it is based around biosecurity measures around each unit of the compartment. So in essence, what we are trying to do is to separate clearly those populations that are free from disease from populations that are still infected. Now, we often think about international borders as barriers for the disease, the spread of disease. This is sometimes true, but sometimes it is not true. Now, let's talk to you about an example. This is the Pan American Highway that goes all the way from the North Pole to Patagonia. This Pan American Highway is not really Pan American. If you go to Panama, it stops at some point in the town of Yavisa before the border with Colombia. And this is what it looks like. This is the Pan American Highway just out of Panama City. If you drive on that highway, eventually it becomes a dirt road, and eventually it dies out and it becomes a river system. Everything moves on the river. There is no road anymore. This is that dirt road, which is what is left of the Pan American Highway. This is the town of Yavisa, and that's where it stops. After this town, there are no vehicles. This bridge here is only for people. No cars can go across it. And as you can see, the territory, it is jungle. This is what is called a true biological barrier. It's very dense jungle that has prevented the introduction of foot and mouth disease from Colombia into Central America. Central America has never been affected by foot and mouth disease. largely because of the efforts of the Panamanian government in conjunction with the rest of the countries in Central America that have for years funded a program for the control, detection and prevention of foot and mouth disease in case it came in, but also helped by this incredible biological border. They have very intensive surveillance in this area where they know exactly where all the producers are located, how many animals they have, and they banned historically the use of cattle in that area. Only pigs for subsistence farming are allowed. And I like this slide that I took when I was visiting there, because we don't necessarily need to have highly sophisticated systems to have efficient surveillance systems. This is a map of one very local area, but every inspector in that program is able to produce maps like that, show them to you, and they can tell you exactly where all the farms are located, and they can tell you exactly how many animals they have, and how many animals were born, how many animals were sold or died. And they can also tell you exactly how long it takes that inspector to go and visit every single of those farms. So in case of an emergency, you know exactly how long it would take to control the disease by visiting each of these different premises. Other examples of international borders are in this region. I was part of a mission with the OIE to visit Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, because there were concerns that Paraguay was still having remnants of foot and mouth disease, and it was affecting neighboring countries. And that year there was an outbreak in Mato Grosso do Sul, right at the border with Paraguay. But there were also outbreaks right at the border between Argentina and Paraguay, and also along the side of Bolivia. But international borders sometimes are not so efficient in preventing the introduction of diseases. Let me show you this a picture of the border between Mato Grosso do Sul and Bolivia in this point. And that's what the border looks like. And I don't mean to offend or point fingers at anyone, but that's reality. So disease control is very difficult when you have a border that is like that. Another border point between Mato Grosso do Sul and Paraguay. The picture is taken from Brazil. I am standing right at the border marking, and the fence back here is Paraguay. Not only it's a land border, but as you can see, there's a gate here. That's a farm in Paraguay with a gate that opens to the border. And on the Brazilian side, there are also farms right at the border with gates that open to the border. And often these properties are owned by either the same people or the same family or relatives. So it's reality. Again, I don't want to say that disease control is inefficient in one country or the other. That's not the point. I just want to point out that the real situation in many countries that have land borders is that those borders are not efficient for disease control purposes. One last example, this is the border between Argentina and Paraguay. Often people tell you, well, we have a river that separates, and that's a biological barrier. I took the picture from Argentina. That's Paraguay on this side. This is the river. And as you can see, cattle are grazing right at the border. All this means that for diseases such as foot and mouth disease or other transboundary animal diseases, we need to think regionally. We cannot control these diseases by individual country actions. We need to figure out a way to integrate regional approaches for the control of these diseases. And recently, a couple of weeks ago, there was a global conference on foot and mouth disease control hosted by the FAO and the OIE in Thailand. And they launched this initiative for a progressive control pathway for the control of foot and mouth disease that is based on regional strategies by the different virus pools they have identified. And they have identified 7 different and distinct virus pools. I'm not talking about the types of foot and mouth disease virus, but genetically related pools of virus that affect several areas of the world. And the idea is that by thinking regionally and approaching disease control from this perspective, the aim is to control and reduce the incidence of FMD in these geographical regions. Zoning, or regionalization as is it called, those terms are interchangeable, is a very useful tool. Even though I've talked about barriers or international borders as sometimes not being very efficient, many countries, and Brazil is a good example of this, do apply zoning as a very efficient way to regionalize disease and export from disease-free zones. The OIE defines a zone as a part of a territory with a distinct animal health status. And it further defines different types of zones. A free zone is a zone where the absence of disease has been demonstrated. And this is easier said than done. Because the one thing is to have the absence of disease because you're not seeing it clinically, but the demonstration of the absence of the infection is a whole different matter, because we need very intensive surveillance. We need to know how surveys are designed, what kind of tests are we going to do, and we also need to incorporate many different surveillance streams with different data to actually demonstrate the absence of infection. An infected zone is, of course, a zone in which a disease has been diagnosed. This is a relatively new definition, because in the past, in the OIE code, an infected zone was defined as a zone where the absence of disease had not been demonstrated, which is not exactly the same. And that old definition, which I liked a bit better, forced countries to actually implement surveillance to demonstrate what the situation is, what the disease status is. But nowadays, if an infected zone is defined as a zone where disease has been demonstrated. A protection zone is a type of zone that is established at the border of a free country or a free zone with the aim of protecting against the introduction of the disease. Now, there are 3 key elements in a protection zone. First of all is the separation between those 2 areas, the infected and the free area. That's the line between those 2 countries. But then there are measures that are applied to reduce the spread of disease. And we do that either through intensive vaccination programs or by reducing the population of susceptible species. And in addition, there are measures that are applied to increase the detection, so intensive surveillance in those protection zones. Protection zones can be established within the border of the free zone, but in OIE rules, if you have an outbreak in this protection zone, which is part of the free zone, the entire zone would lose its condition in the event of an outbreak. Some countries establish these protection zones outside, so within the infected zone. And that's relatively easy to do if it's the same country.
but it's a whole different matter if it's between countries. However, there are some examples where this has been applied. Again, I go back to Panama, and Panama has this intensive surveillance area in the Darien Gap, so this is the green, is still Panama, but through efforts with the government of Colombia and also USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, there's a big disease-free zone without vaccination in Colombia that acts as a buffer, as a protection zone against the introduction of disease. In other parts of the world, the European Union has funded an intensive program that led to the creation of a disease-free zone in Turkey, bordering Greece, to protect against the introduction of foot and mouth disease, which is endemic in Turkey, into the European Union. So there are some examples where these protection zones are established in a neighboring country to protect against the introduction of disease. Another example or another type of zone is what is called a containment zone. And this is a new concept that has been established in the OIE code with the purpose of helping countries regain trade, which is what matters, exporting, in a faster time frame. And a containment zone has to have several conditions. First of all, it's only applicable when you have a limited outbreak, so only a few herds that are infected. And you need to consider epidemiological factors, so you need to conduct a thorough epidemiological investigation. You need to make sure that the disease is not spreading outside of that containment zone. But in order, once you've done that, you can establish the limits of the zone and begin trade from the rest of the country while you are still in the process of controlling the disease in that zone. So here we have a free country with a limited outbreak, and you're able to establish this containment zone and export from the rest of the country. And this has the purpose to enable the country to regain international trade quicker while they're still ending the cleaning up process in this containment zone. And there are several conditions that are laid out in the OIE code on what you need to do and how all this needs to be done. So how does epidemiology help us comply with this regionalization provision of the SPS agreement? As I mentioned a while ago, we need to demonstrate disease freedom. It's no longer valid to say, I don't have the disease because I haven't seen it. I need to demonstrate that the disease is not there. And this is very challenging. In the case of foot and mouth disease, if you're a country that is free without vaccination, you need to demonstrate the absence of infection. So no virus has to be present. That means that you need to have very intensive serological surveys, very intensive clinical surveillance, both in active way at slaughterhouses or during inspections of animals prior to movement, and also disease reporting. Your producers, your veterinarians need to be aware of how to report, what to report, and what are the consequences of reporting. We need to know how to design appropriate surveys for this purpose. We need to also understand how our tests work. We know that tests are not perfect. They have sensitivity and specificity problems. We need to adjust for those that lack of accuracy in those tests. We need to know also how to interpret the test results at a herd level, not only at the individual animal level, and extrapolate those results to calculate herd level sensitivity and specificity. This, of course, has a link with risk analysis, and we also need to integrate multiple surveillance streams that sometimes are just clinical inspections, because with a serological survey, you can never demonstrate the absence of disease or infection. There's always a gap. that is limited by the design of the survey itself. So how do you fill that gap? You fill it with other sources of information. And even with those, you can never completely demonstrate the absence of disease, but sufficient enough to warrant a disease status recognition and engage in international trade. Risk analysis, and this afternoon we'll talk about risk analysis in greater length, but it is the evaluation of the likelihood of introduction, establishment, and spread of a disease within a country or a zone, and the associated biological and economic consequences. Why do we need epidemiology for risk analysis? I can't conceive risk analysis without epidemiology. Epidemiology is the backbone of animal health risk analysis, and we need to understand the mechanisms of transmission of disease. We need to understand the pathways for disease introduction. We need to understand and be able to measure the effects of different mitigation options that we will choose, and in order to figure out how much risk we are reducing. And therefore, epidemiology is essential in risk analysis. The third provision of the SPS agreement is harmonization. Harmonization means, under the SPS agreement, the establishment and recognition and application of common sanitary measures. And how are we going to do that when we have many countries all over the world? We need the OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, who is responsible for developing, along with the member countries, these international standards. Epidemiology has to be involved throughout the process of developing these international standards. Otherwise, we would be violating one of the key conditions of the SPS agreement, which is that all sanitary measures need to be scientifically based. And epidemiology is what provides that scientific basis. For example, when you develop criteria for disease freedom, and there's the example of rinderpest, the guidelines for surveillance for rinderpest, which by the way has been declared globally eradicated in 2011, it's the only animal disease that has been globally eradicated. It was done with very strict surveillance criteria that were laid out in the code. And the OIE code said exactly what level of confidence you needed to use, what expected prevalence at the herd level, at the within herd level, in order to design the surveys to declare disease freedom. I have the fortune of being a member of the OIE group on epidemiology, along with Dr. Victor Gonçalves, who's also here in the room. And one of the responsibilities of that group is to develop surveillance guidelines. And we have developed surveillance guidelines that are generic and then specific for several diseases, including foot and mouth disease, classical swine fever, blue tongue, and several others. And the philosophy we are applying there is a little bit different than this. This is extremely prescriptive. It tells you exactly what you need to do. What we are doing now is rather explain what are the key principles in surveillance, in survey design, and therefore allowing the countries to justify what level of confidence they're choosing, what design prevalence they're choosing for the surveillance of the design of their surveillance systems, and therefore allowing a lot more latitude for countries to do what they need to do, because we recognize that from the headquarters of the OIE in Paris, you cannot dictate what every country needs to do, because Brazil is very different from Nicaragua, and Nicaragua is very different from Kazakhstan. So the realities of production systems, the realities of trade vary, and therefore we need to be able to be flexible and adapt and recognize those differences. Which leads us to the concept of equivalence. We need to be able to recognize that different sanitary measures may achieve similar results. And this allows this concept of equivalence for flexibility, not only in the application of these measures, but in how we structure our veterinary services, how do we design our surveillance systems. And with this idea of flexibility, we can achieve a lot more. So we need, of course, the support of epidemiology to be able to measure and compare if sanitary measures are equivalent or not. We also need to develop criteria to define what is that appropriate level of protection. But overall, this idea of equivalence hinges on the outputs rather than how to get there. So as long as a country is able to provide a certain level of information to support its sanitary status, it doesn't matter how they achieve, how they organize themselves to do that, as long as the expectations of the international community are being met. Finally, we have the idea of transparency. Transparency is the basis for trust. Trade, international trade, is reliant on trusting what a veterinary certificate says. That veterinary certificate that accompanies a shipment of meat from Brazil, for example, means nothing unless it represents a complete infrastructure behind it. And in order to be transparent, we need to understand that infrastructure, how it operates, how it's funded, the level of education of the veterinarians within that system, how does it work? We need to understand clearly how does it work. And also, countries need to report to the OIE the occurrence of diseases in their territory. And there are certain rules on how often they need to report and what types of diseases need to be reported and so on. So we need to really be very open if we want to engage in international trade. So we need trust, and trust is a very perishable commodity. It takes a long time to develop, but you can lose it in a second. So we need to work towards maintaining that trust, and of course disease surveillance systems and disease reporting are essential in that process. We have a challenge. Ever since the SPS agreement came into life, we've been faced with this challenge, and in these difficult economic times, the challenge is still there. We have been placed in this situation as veterinary services where there are a lot of expectations from us. The SPS measures are in the spotlight, not only from the ministries of agriculture, but from the ministries of finance, increasingly nowadays from the ministries of public health as well. And we need to make sure that we are complying with these international regulations. So there are increasing demands on the veterinary infrastructure. We need to demonstrate our animal health status, and we need to have efficient surveillance systems. At the same time, we have budgets that are shrinking. And in some countries, the effect is severe, leading to poor veterinary infrastructures. Even, for example, in the United States, we are facing a severe restructuring of veterinary services due to budgetary constraints. So we need to adapt and be flexible in order to meet these challenges. And some of the measures or options we have to adapt to meet these challenges rely on involving the private sector. We need to have schemes for accreditation of private veterinarians to perform public duties. In the United States, we have around 30,000 accredited veterinarians that are in the field. They are private veterinarians, but are able to sign certificates for export that are then ratified by an official veterinarian. or perform other duties. There is no disease control program in the world that is effective unless the private sector is involved. But they also need to contribute financially to those disease control efforts. And finally, we have privatization, for example, of diagnostic laboratories. So we need to be creative and allow for different schemes that enable us to meet this incredible challenge that the SPS agreement has placed upon veterinary services and still be able to comply with that agreement with all the budgetary constraints that we are faced with today. In conclusion, I would like to say that the SPS agreement has really changed the way in which we make decisions related to animal health. And many countries still face implementation problems. And as epidemiologists, we are ideally placed to help governments, to help these veterinary services comply with the SPS agreement, because we are the ones that are able to integrate scientific knowledge from many different sources into a veterinary public policy, which brings me back to the title of this presentation, Epidemiology and Veterinary Public Policy. One way to think about this, just to finalize, you are all familiar with the epidemiological triad, in which we have the host, the agent, and the environment. And the balance of these three different points of this triangle dictate the balance of health or disease in a population. And this is the basis of epidemiology, and that's fine. And it works very well when we have controlled populations. But when we are thinking about disease control at a country level or at a regional level affecting many countries, we still need to think about this. But we also need to think about social, economic, political, and religious factors that affect my epidemiological triad. So the epidemiological triad becomes the basis of a pyramid. And these social, economic, and religious factors are fundamental for us to understand the occurrence of disease. And there are many examples around the world that I don't have time to go into today, where really what is driving the occurrence of diseases are social, economic, or religious factors. And the failure to understand them properly will lead to failure in controlling diseases. So we need to think bigger. We need to think beyond just veterinary medicine. We need to understand a lot more, which means that we need to build multidisciplinary teams that include sociologists, economists, geographers, entomologists, a wide array of people in order to really do our job properly. So the SPS agreement is here to stay. Even if the WTO were to disappear today, I believe that an SPS agreement in one shape or another would remain, because it really has helped countries to think about how they are applying sanitary measures and how to comply with these sanitary measures in a more structured and orderly way. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm sure there might be some questions. I think we have some time for that. Thank you very much.